Welcome to Timeline Iran. I'm Babak Kalhor. Our guest today is Rudi Matthee. Professor Matthee is the John and Dorothy Monroe Distinguished Professor of History in the History Department at the University of Delaware. He teaches Middle Eastern history and specializes in the history of early modern Iran. He received his PhD in 1991 from UCLA. Professor Matthee is a past president of the Association for the Study of Persianate Societies and current president of the President Heritage Foundation, and two-time fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. He is the author of numerous books and articles which have won several prizes on Safavid and Qajar Iran. His expertise is in Middle Eastern history with a focus on Iran and the Arab world. He additionally has a specific interest in alcohol, drugs, and stimulants, coffee, tea, tobacco, and their impact as forces in history. Today, amongst other things, we will discuss his latest book, Angels Tapping at the Wine Shop's Door, A History of Alcohol in the Islamic World. Professor Matthee, welcome.
Thank you very much, Babak. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here again.
Why did you write this book?
And please call me Rudi, by the way.
Rudi, why did you write this book knowing that it would be a controversial subject?
First of all, I like controversial subjects because I think they bring out aspects of any society that normally don't get a lot of play, and that's certainly true for Islam, the Islamic world, because there are lots of controversial subjects here. I've written about drugs and stimulants in Iranian history before, and that was kind of the impetus for this final book, or this, the book that I just published. The real impetus beyond the fact that it's a taboo topic in some ways is that alcohol has proven to be a juggernaut in human history. And most religions, certainly the monotheistic ones, have put limitations on it, have cautioned against excessive use. Islam is the only religion that has tried to put a ban on it, to prescribe it totally. And the interesting thing, and this is one of my theses, is Islam too has had to accommodate alcohol in some way. But again, to come back to your question, it's a fascinating topic because it opens up all kinds of portals to social, political, and economic history. It provides a perspective that you don't get from just looking at economic issues or political conditions or social relations. It opens up hidden corners of society. It deals with ideas of notions of privacy and the public sphere, which are particularly sensitive and very interesting in Islam, the discrepancy between the two, things of that nature, and many other issues. But really this sort of paradox of alcohol being formally forbidden, on the one hand, and then of course ubiquitous use of alcohol in the Islamic world, and that includes Muslims themselves, aside from the minorities who were typically allowed to produce and consume alcohol within their own communities, but it of course always spilled over into the Islamic community.
Considering the ban of alcohol in Islam, you would expect that there's been nothing to write about, yet your book is very colorful and covers the long period in different regions of the world. Even the origins of the word alcohol, it comes from Arabic, booze.
Yeah, that's very true, and I begin with that in my introduction, which is, that's where the surprise begins for the non-initiated, which it means most people, and certainly most Western people are non-Muslims. The word alcohol comes from alcohol in Arabic, which is crushed antimony, which is eyeliner, really. And then, of course, you look further into the language of Arabic as a language, and you see that Arabic has all kinds of terms for drinking alcohol. There's a term for drinking alcohol late at night. There's a term for drinking alcohol in the morning. There's one for drinking alcohol as early in the morning as you can, al-mubakara in Arabic. There's a term for the midnight swill. There are authors who use hundreds of terms for alcohol. And then, of course, the whole idea of distillation, a particular type of alcohol resulting from this, is also ascribed to the Islamic world. Fakhruddin Razi, a 12th and 13th century luminary, who presumably invented the whole idea of distilling alcohol. So there are plenty of indications that alcohol is deeply ingrained in the Islamic world.
You bring up an interesting topic in your introduction about the paradox that alcohol is integral to the constitution of the Islamic culture just by its absence. Please elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, that goes again to the heart of the matter, in the sense that officially it's forbidden, and therefore it doesn't exist, presumably. But then when you sort of go beneath the surface, you start poking into the reality, and you realize that there is an enormous amount of alcohol, that the consumption of alcohol, and the production of alcohol for that matter, originates in the Middle East, in what is now the Islamic world, in the Caucasus, in northwestern Iran, in eastern Anatolia, and so forth. And B, that there have been the use of alcohol in the Islamic world is excessive, and certainly bar none, at least on par with European use. And this idea that, for example, binge drinking originated in Germany, or in sort of the Germanic world, has to be thrown out right there, because arguably it started somewhere in the Islamic world. So it is, through its very absence, is one of my arguments, that alcohol becomes present and in a way ubiquitous. By which I do not want to say, and this is a caveat, I never meant to brand Muslims as inveterate drinkers, or to portray the Islamic world as simply awash in alcohol, or simply given to hypocrisy in banning it on the one hand and consuming it avidly on the other hand. That was never my intention. Nor do I try to paint kind of a nostalgic image of, the Levantine culture, the Greeks, the Armenians, people in Lebanon, and the port cities of the Ottoman Empire, Alexandria, and so forth, engaging in a sort of an alcoholic culture, and then being driven out in the modern world. And so we look back with nostalgia on this lost world. That's also not what I intend to do in this book. I try to offer an honest portrayal of the use of alcohol in the Islamic world, without casting stones, without criticizing it, but I bring out contradictions and paradoxes, and I think that's the heart of the book, and that's also the importance of the book in a way.
What's the world's earliest wine culture?
As far as we know, other than China, and it's a bit contested, but the best argument is for the region that I already delineated, meaning the Caucasus, southern Caucasus, northwestern Iran, and eastern Anatolia. The oldest wine vessels, or vessels with remnants of wine, have been found in Georgia, Armenia, Georgia, perhaps going back 9,000 years ago. Of course, wine was ubiquitous in Babylonia, in Persia, in Achaemenid Persia, 500 BC, so to speak, in the Egyptian world, pharaonic Egypt. So whatever the precise origins of certainly wine, but also beer, of course. The Babylonians, the Sumerians invented beer. All of that certainly goes back to that part of the world.
We definitely want to go over the impact of alcohol throughout the Muslim world. But this is Timeline Iran, and I particularly want to put a little bit of an emphasis on Iran. Talk about the role it played in ancient Zoroastrian tradition.
In Zoroastrianism, wine had this, it was kind of equivalent to the radiant sun, and in that sense had an important function. There was a libation ritual, spilling wine, offering it to the gods, or to the deity, so to speak. And of course it also was consumed banquet style by the court and its entourage, and it carried over that way from pre-Islamic to Islamic Iran. There's a clear transition there through the Sasanians and into Islamic Iran. So wine was kind of flowing fire. I mean, the worship of the sun, importance of the sun in Zoroastrianism was kind of symbolized by wine.
The Quran has a lot of recreates a lot of the characters and stories from the Bible and the Torah. How is alcohol treated in translating these stories?
Wine figures in both the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, as well as in the Quran. If you look at the Bible, it's used as a cautionary tale, but it plays a clear role in various stories, such as the one of Noah being found in a state of drunkenness and naked. And then, of course, there is a story in the New Testament of Jesus, turning water into wine at the marriage of Cana. And some of these stories you find are replicated in the Quran, but the wine is kind of written out of it. And that's a very interesting difference right there. Unlike the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, which warn against overconsumption and excessive use of wine, in the Quran there's an element of total marginalization, total proscription, but surrounded by ambiguity, which begins with the Quran itself. The Quran shows kind of a sequence, a chronological sequence, even though, of course, the Quran is not structured chronologically, but modern research has established kind of a trajectory, a chronological one. There's one verse in the Quran that accords a positive value to wine. Wine is good nourishment for people, and it's almost a gift of God to humankind. And then there's a different verse that cautions against excessive consumption. And then there is another verse that warns against drinking or prayer in a state of drunkenness, which makes sense, of course, but you can't pray with a muddled head. And then there's the final verse in Surah 5, which mentions wine as satanic, on par with gambling, for example, and in other words, to be avoided. So there's clear proscription there. But the interesting thing is that, first of all, we have this sequence, so there are kind of apparently contradictory elements to be found in the Quran regarding wine. But more importantly, only red wine is explicitly forbidden in Islam, khamr in Arabic. So the Quran doesn't talk about date wine, which is ubiquitous in the period. And it doesn't talk about white wine. It doesn't talk about all kinds of other manifestations of alcohol, most of which, of course, came in later, champagne and cognac and so forth. But still, this clear and explicit focus on khamr, on red wine, has had all kinds of consequences, because it has led Muslims to find loopholes, ways around it, rationalization for drinking anything but red wine. The idea that is ultimately also the drunkenness, more than the actual wine that is clearly forbidden or castigated as sinful in Islam, has also led Muslims in later periods to argue that, well, as long as you don't get drunk, it's okay. A few drops is fine. One glass is fine. It's the limit is getting drunk and becoming incapacitated to be a good Muslim. So in other words, there's a whole spectrum of possibilities left open by the Quran, effectively.
Yeah, these debates have gone on to talk about some of the different aspects of these debates that they've had.
Yes, they continue until today in a way, but they started right away. Of course, all induced, you might argue, as a historian, that wine and alcohol was so ingrained in society, because after all, Islam took over, certainly after it came out of the Arabian Peninsula, a huge territory which was mostly inhabited by Christians and Jews, for whom wine, alcohol was normal, certainly within this boundary of not getting drunk. So it had to conquer an enormous civilization, and in the end it failed to do that. So the debate started right away. And of course, wine is also the other interesting thing, of course, and I come back to the initial point I make. Wine is proven to be a juggernaut. No society, no civilization has been able to resist it, right? Quran also bans pork. Pork is the first thing Muslims give up, It's the last they'll take to, because no one has ever become addicted to pork. It's tasty, it's savory, but no one has to have pork in the morning, right? But wine, alcohol, is addictive, and it's also bounded with sociability, and it conjures up a whole ambiance and so forth. So that's another reason why it proved to be very difficult to get away from alcohol. So again, to come back to the point, that debate started immediately after the death of the Prophet in the form of the Hadith, which is, of course, the presumed sayings of the Prophet and his direct companions. Is wine, the fact that red wine is forbidden, does that mean that all wine is forbidden? Does that mean that nabith, which is the term for date wine mostly, or non-grape wine, is that forbidden? And if it's not, can we drink? How much can we drink? So endless debate, really meant and designed to find loopholes, clearly. And then, of course, a variety of opinions, from total ban, the Wahhabis, the ones who ended up prevailing in the Arabian Peninsula in modern Saudi Arabia, total ban, no questions asked, there's just definitive, no exceptions, to the Hanafis, who prevail in the Turkic world, Central Asia, modern Turkey, and so forth, for whom things are slightly more flexible. There's a little more leeway, Nabith, okay, sure. It's not good to drink wine, but there are, some exceptions here and there, and as long as you don't get totally drunk, that's crossing the line. That's, of course, anathema. But up to that point, maybe it's permissible. And again, it depends, one jurist from another. There are also different opinions, of course, fatwas. So there is all that. And then, of course, there was always a surrounding society, because Islam accorded and accords officially certain privileges to its minorities, so-called dhimmis, the people of the book, meaning Christians and Jews effectively, and also Zoroastrians in effect, practically. There were simply too many of them to convert them forcibly, all of them. So these so-called people of the book were allowed to produce and consume alcohol within their own circles. But then, of course, and then they tended to run the taverns, which were, of course, also frequented by Muslims, because they tended to be on the periphery of towns, so that the dark corners, and people would sneak in under the cover of night, and then stay overnight, there till the hangover was gone and the smell, the breath was gone, and then to go back home. And everyone knew about it. So this was kind of, don't ask, don't tell. And that is a pervasive theme throughout Islam, in a way. And then, of course, there are other elements, that also mitigate this ban, one of which is the idea of repentance. You can always repent for your sins in Islam. Sin is not ingrained. It's not like you're not born with it, like in Christianity, right? Sin is a willful rejection of God, and you can always return to God. So you can always confess your sins and with a clean slate. So that led to a whole culture too, meaning mostly this idea that, you're young and you want to have fun, right? That's of all times. And so we allow young people to drink. I mean, again, it's forbidden, but, there's so many things that are either sinful or frowned upon, and yet we allow them. There's a certain level of tolerance. But then when you reach 40, 50, and old age looms, you have to engage in tawbah, or tawbeh, meaning repentance. You have to come clean, and you have to give up your sinful life and behavior and profess never to do it again, and God will forgive you. It's a great way of coming clean, and in a way having your cake or having your wine and eat it too, so drink it too in this particular case. So there are all kinds of devices that have been used and utilized by Muslims to get around this presumably strict ban on alcohol.
What was the economic effect of the Islamic conquest, on areas that had alcohol or wine production?
Varies from place to place, and the documentation, of course, is not in all cases abundantly available to make definitive statements. But in many cases, in Egypt, of course, we know that Palestine, that the vineyards shriveled, were destroyed, that there was a retrenchment of viticulture. But then again, it didn't totally disappear either, because again, these minorities were allowed to grow their wine and consume their wine. And then, very importantly, and this is a theme that runs through history really until today in some ways, wine, the consumption and certainly production of wine brings in fiscal revenue, which a state inherently cannot forgo. The state is always short on money. So there was always this tension. On the one hand, the impulse to ban, to prescribe, to make it illegal to drink. And on the other hand, of course, the income you you forego by doing so. So there was always tension between that. Of course, Muslim governments could never simply allow drinking because, there was always the injunction in the Quran. So they always had to navigate, and they always had to, find a balance between, again, the religious injunction on the one hand and the fiscal income on the other hand. And typically the fiscal income prevailed. Because what you see over time really is sort of almost an incantatory series of decrees issued over time. Typically when a ruler came to power, he had to establish his Islamic credentials, which means, of course, decreeing a ban on alcohol, right? But it was highly symbolic, oftentimes repeated, and right there, of course, you sense that it was ineffective. If a ban has to be repeated periodically, it means it's being violated, right? And there are other moments, in advance of a battle, sort of invoking God's graces, perpetuating God's for one's own sins, for example, following a battle, thankfulness to the heavens that, the enemies were beaten, things of that nature. When there were plagues, epidemics, disease, and so forth, again, to perpetuate the heavens, you decree a ban. And that runs through history pretty much. But again, most of these bans were heeded more in the breach than in the observance. And they were always, or almost always, a haphazard and typically of fairly short duration. And again, that's a theme that runs through history from beginning to end.
There's always been a class or status distinction throughout different dynasties and Islamic empires.
Yes, that plays a very important role too. It wasn't, of course, invented by Islam because every society has a distinction between the wealthy and the powerful on the one hand and the poor, the deprived, and the powerless on the other hand. And the wealthy always have more privileges, whether officially sanctioned or simply because they can, because they have the power, is kind of immaterial. But that distinction always exists. And it exists in a very pronounced way when it comes to the use of alcohol in the Islamic world, because there was the idea that rulers had certain privileges. They were there was a reason why they were rulers. They had the special sanction from God, right? And they were also the discerning elite. It's like the British in the 18th century, and the upper classes were allowed to drink their port and their sherry because they could hold their liquor. They didn't end up in the gutter doing that. They didn't engage in brawls, in part because they didn't live out on the streets. They could keep it within their mansions behind high walls. Whereas, there were these campaigns against gin craze in the 18th century because, the people of the street, the lowlifes, they would make a mess of things. They would get into brawls and, crime and murder. And that same distinction exists in the Islamic world as well. Of course, the elites, the courts, the sultans, the khans, the shahs, they could also engage in drinking, again, literally behind their tall walls. So they didn't have to engage in open hypocrisy. And that was another distinction in general, that, as long as alcohol was used in the private sphere, it wasn't good, it wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't officially allowed, but it was, tolerated, if you will. And that was the main distinction. Even the poor people, as long as they kept it within the confines of the semi-private sphere, then few measures were ever taken. And that goes back to Islam as well. Islam is very strong on the privacy of the home. The haram, the andarun in Persian, is the precinct, the inviolable precinct of the man and his family, meaning his wife or wives and his children. And there's a very strong, Quranically underwritten notion that the private sphere of the male is inviolable. And in other words, the muhtasib, the morality police, could not simply intrude upon the private sphere. It was off limits. And that gave an enormous amount of leeway for drinking and other, untoward behavior to people. As long as they kept it inside, okay, we will look the other way.
One of the things you touch upon, and you have some beautiful illustrations in your book as well, is the history of wine in Islamic art. Whether it's paintings, poetry, literature, it's always been somewhere under the surface, and sometimes above the surface.
Right. True, and an immensely rich part of the culture, and there's a whole chapter in the book about it. But you could easily write an entire book, a separate book about that. First of all, that literary tradition, of course, is in part carryover from pre-Islamic times. There's a rich Arabic poetry, pre-Islamic, the mu'allaqat, the hanging verses, so to speak. That's a translation of that, or the suspended verses. They're filled with wine. Wine, again, as an emblem of beauty, but also sociability. And that was carried over into Islamic poetry. So right there's a transition there. And then secondly, we have, first of all, there's the pictorial part of art, the visual arts. We have a lot of that. Very open, sort of given the lie to this idea that in Islam we don't have representative art, no humans and animals are being depicted. That's just nonsense. It's certainly not true for the Eastern Islamic world, the Persian world, so to speak. It's filled with humans, and it's filled with wine drinking. There are certain standards and certain tropes, sort of patterns, if you will, but it's ubiquitous really until the 19th century, and then it kind of disappears. And that is an important idea, because the kind of free-flowing depiction of alcohol and nudity for one, because that too exists in paintings, and there's actually a picture in the book that shows you that very clearly, disappeared. And maybe we can talk about that later, under which circumstances these things were sort of purified and cleaned up, if you will. But in the classical period, coming back to poetry, we have poetry drenched in alcohol, because alcohol plays a very important role. It plays mostly a symbolic role. It stands for beauty. It's the beauty of the red wine swirling in the goblet with the sun refracted in the wine, so that you get this beautiful, kaleidoscopic red, right? You swirl a glass in sunlight, and it's simply beautiful, right? And wine then, for the Sufi, for the mystic, because we're mostly talking about mystical poetry, also becomes a metaphor for the beauty of the universe as created by God. See, if God created wine, it cannot be sinful, it cannot be ugly. It's indeed a beautiful element of a beautiful universe as created by God. So why can we not partake of that, right, within limits? So that's another element. And then the third one is the idea, there's of course also the notion that a lot of mystics were drunks, were alcoholics. So, this idea that it's all symbolic also has to be counteracted with this notion that a lot of people were given to drink, and they represented it in their poetry. But there's also the idea, this is an important element in poetry, and again, especially in mystical poetry, Khayyam, and Hafiz, of course, very famously, but also Abu Nuwas, much earlier, of wine as a symbol of transgressiveness, of defiance. It's almost like, and Khayyam is very big on this, a cri de coeur, a scream at the universe, at God. How and why did you create all this injustice? So it's a revolt against God, and wine plays a very important role in that whole panoply of meaning imbued. And then of course there's Hafiz, who fulminates against the hypocrisy, the cant, the clerics who decry wine and declare anyone who touches it, even one drop, an infidel, right, who will burn in hell forever, and then of course come back into the tavern through the back door in order to partake of it themselves. And then Hafiz also uses, he throws wine on the prayer rug in the mosque. How blasphemous can you get? In order to indicate, to suggest, to tell us how far above he is above sort of the ordinary injunctions of Islam, which are good for ordinary people. But he's a rind, he's a vagabond. He lives by his own rules. He has a special knowledge of the universe. He has a special connection to God, which is far beyond the comprehension of everyone else, which is ultimately what Sufism is all about, of course. It's a band of initiated who have this special connection to the heavens. And so wine again plays an extremely, indeed, a pivotal role in all of that.
Your book goes through this chronologically and geographically. So start with us. I really want to get to the later stages, but paint us a picture of the ban on Islam and how it was enforced through the early Islamic dynasties.
Okay.
Let's start kind of from the
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah.
And
You
we'll
begin
move
with the
forward.
Umayyads.
Umayyads, Abbasids, yeah.
Umayyads 661, 750. Abbasis 750 to 1258. And when the Mongols come in, and then it sort of breaks down. It fragments the Islamic world into sub-dynasties, and then ultimately we end up with the Ottomans in the west, so to speak. North African dynasties, the Mamluks, and other various dynasties all the way to Morocco. And then in Iran you have the Safavids, and in the east, India, so to speak, you have the Mughals. That's kind of the sort of the setup. Well, there's lots of commonality. Some of the things I've already talked about pertain to all these dynasties. The distinction between the what they call the khas, meaning the elite on the one hand, and the am, or the awam, the common people, both of whom drank a lot, and that's actually also a pattern. The middle classes tended to be more pious and abstain by and large and for the most part. So there is that tripartite division. But again, that runs through time pretty much. The same holds for these injunctions, partly symbolic, incantatory, to perpetuate the heavens, to wish for a good outcome of a war or a battle, or to pray for the end of an epidemic or something like that. And then again, badly enforced. Because you also have to realize pre-modern states didn't have the disciplinary power that modern states have. There's no comparison. The surveillance power that we have as a state today, nothing like that existed. And how were you going to control a huge area other than maybe the capital and some connecting roads between various provincial cities, with an army without any proper tools and a whole government apparatus which is badly equipped? So right there you have a major difference. How do you enforce? And the answer is you couldn't. The clerics, of course, typically, and again that's a pattern and a theme that runs through time, tended to fulminate against wine or the use of alcohol, to the extent that they didn't use it themselves, again through the back door. But they were typically powerless. This idea that the clerics ruled has to be thrown out the window, because states tended to follow their own rationale, their own interests, and clerics were at best advisors, right? And they could be ignored, and they typically were ignored. And sometimes they were listened to the extent that it was important to prop up the legitimacy of the state temporarily, but they never really controlled the clerics. That's a misconception, right? So all these things continue over time in different shape and form. There's a new element that comes with the Turks arriving, so to speak, from Central Asia, men on horseback. They bring their own alcohol, kumis, mare's milk, for example. They bring their own heavy drinking habits. The Mongols are, of course, preternaturally drunk. It's not for nothing that most of them die very young, the Mongol rulers. They're enormous booze hounds. And they bring their habits to a world that's already used to alcohol, so it becomes integrated. But you also get new patterns in a way, because you see, for example, the emergence of what is called the mirror for princes literature, meaning advisory literature. It's like Machiavelli's The Prince, right? It's an manual of advice for a ruler. How to maintain power once you achieve power, and how to be able to hand over power to your son or your offspring, right? And what happens in between. So also how to behave as a proper, educated, sophisticated ruler. And there you see a very interesting dynamic coming in, because a lot of this advice literature, I'm talking about the Qabusname and the Siyasatname, they're two of the highlights, but there are many more. They were also ways to instruct the rustic Turk from the steppes of Central Asia into the sophisticated habits of the Persians. So, table manners, eating with a knife and fork, how to do that, so to speak. But also, and how to deal with your women and your concubines. Also, how to deal with your underlings. You appoint shadow officials in order to keep tabs on them, because everyone is spying on everyone else. You want to be in control in the end. But again, there is an element of etiquette involved. It's a very important component. And that includes wine drinking. How to drink wine, what kind of wine to drink, not to drink too much. Because there was always the adage, rulers can drink, and they can drink to excess, but never to the point of losing control. It should not come at the expense of statecraft. And there are explicit passages in all these manuals, even in religious manuals, otherwise religiously grounded. There's always this idea the ruler can drink. Of course, he has to repent at the end of his life, like all of us. But it cannot come at the expense of good governance, because that's, of course, central. So that's a very interesting new element, these manuals of good conduct. And then, of course, the Islamic world basically ends up being ruled by Turkic and Turkish dynasties all the way, in some cases, into the 20th century. Other than that, I would argue that a lot of the patterns that I just sketched pretty much remain in place with variants.
How did drinking habits change in the 19th century?
Drinking
again, different periods, Ottoman, Qajar, Iran, and the Arab world, how you divided it.
Right. Yeah, but again, here there are common patterns. I mean, there are variants, but there are themes there. Well, the common denominator is modernization, and it means the coming of the West, pretty much. The West was always there, but in small numbers, without real influence. There was also always the association of drinking and drinks with Westerners. If you look at the depiction in the visual arts, it's oftentimes a Westerner with a cup in his hand. So there's that identification. But Westerners come massively, and in new guise in the early 19th century, no longer as petitioners, but as commanding forces. Diplomats, military commanders, imperialists. Right? That's the difference between anything before, say, Napoleon. To mention a major rupture. Invasion of Egypt on the one hand, and anything that happens afterward. In part because, again, the Westerners become as masters, as people in command who control, even though that becomes an issue because it's the idea of alco-imperialism, which is a term that was coined not too long ago, certainly doesn't pertain in a straightforward way in the Middle East. Westerners, however powerful they were, they knew better than so simply impose their own alcoholic habits and build factories and sort of encourage an industry of alcohol. The French, for example, in North Africa, they pursued what they called a politique des égards, so a politics of circumspection, sensitive to Muslim sensibilities. So no drinking in the vicinity of mosques and schools, and very light on the ground in Muslim neighborhoods and so forth. They were very careful not to offend Muslim sensibilities, as an example. But still, to come back to the original question, so it's modernization, which in this case is almost synonymous with westernization. But there are differences. For example, the Safavids, or the Qajars, they come up, late turn of the 19th century, right? The Qajars, they followed the Safavids and the dynasties, the many ephemeral dynasties of the 18th century, in being heavy drinkers. Not all of them, but they lack legitimacy. They don't have the religious legitimacy of the Safavids. The Safavids introduced Shia Islam, Twelver Shiism. The Qajars were kind of an upstart tribal formation. They had to acquire legitimacy, right? They had to prove themselves. And they did so by being more stringent about the ban on alcohol in public, and then they retreated into their palace, consuming it themselves. Whereas the Safavids were inheritors of the old Central Asian razmubazm habits of, warriors getting drunk before battle and after battle. If you win, you have a reason to drink, and if you lose, you have another reason to drink, right? So the Qajars were more selective. They became ensconced in their palace, We know Fath Ali Shah drank. We don't know how much he drank. But then the ones after that, Muhammad Shah, for example, 1834 to 48, he's a teetotaler. So they do follow the rules, in part because they have to project an Islamic aura, because they inherently lack legitimacy in any other way. It doesn't come natural to them, right? So we have that tension. And then Nasruddin Shah, the longest living Qajar ruler, is very interesting because he becomes almost sophisticated Western. He no longer engages in these drunken orgies, because that was typically what rulers engaged in, right? Drunken orgies. Almost on par with the Russian scene, Peter the Great, and pretty much all Russian rulers. No, Nadir Shah, he likes a glass of Bordeaux, over dinner, which in another way is a total break with the past, because alcohol was never consumed with dinner. Western, Greek, Mediterranean style, enhancing the quality, the ambiance of the dinner and the company, right? That's how ideally at least, we drink in the West. It doesn't always work that way, but that's how wine is being advertised and how it's, integrated into society. That was, and I forgot to mention that was never the case in Islam, because it had to do with the forbidden fruit element. If it's forbidden, you go all out, right? No bounds. So there is that. That's part of the modernization. It becomes slightly more sophisticated. And again, Nasruddin Shah is a very interesting example. He drinks 2 or 3 glasses of Bordeaux over dinner, not every night. And he drinks a little bit before executions to calm his nerves, because he's a little bit, he's not the old, cruel ruler who just slays them himself, like Abbas I or something like that, right? Executes his enemies in person and single-handedly. The contrast is the Ottoman Empire. Very interesting contrast, because you have less drinking throughout the Ottoman Empire, as less than Iran. There are several reports. Iranians are inveterate drinkers. They drink more than the Turks. Okay, and I think you can sort of posit that and follow that up with literature. But of course, Istanbul and Izmir, half of which are populated by Christians, right? Unlike Iran, where the Christians are very small in numbers, there's a lot of drinking, because most of these taverns are run by Jews and Greeks and Armenians, right? But the court, until 1800s, Mahmud II is the ruler, the pivotal ruler here. Well, it depends. Some rulers are complete alcoholics, and absolutely, they die from delirium tremens. We know that. There are reports about that, right? Drinking pure alcohol towards the end of their lives. But then some were teetotalers, so it fluctuates. But certainly not in public, typically, right? But then with the early 19th century, and this is where the contrast with Iran comes in, the Ottoman Sultan, Mahmud II again, he begins to come out of his palace, because that's always been the difference. Iranian court has always been open, like the steppes. You hold court out in the open. You live not in the city, you live in the bar, you live in tents, so it's an open spectacle. Ottoman sultans lived in their Topkapi Palace, immured, completely unseen, invisible. No one ever heard the Sultan speak. He was always behind, a mashrabiyah. He could see you, but you couldn't see him. He was too elevated to be perceived, right? That begins to change. Mahmud begins to engage in excursions, carefully orchestrated ones, of course, along the Bosphorus, a boat ride here. His officials are invited. We have standing legations, meaning diplomatic representation by the English and the French and the Habsburgs, the Austrians, and they organize receptions, as embassies still do, right? And they invite high officials, chief minister, and they begin to show up there, and they drink, and then they start drinking a lot, right? Because they are used to all or nothing. You either don't drink at all, and you don't drink in general for fun or for the taste. You drink to get drunk. That's almost a given in Islamic drink. And again, this is notion of forbidden fruit. So you go all out, right? So there are scandals. Of course, it's never written up in the press, but we get these reports from Western observers and participants, right? And so there's an opening up there. The new palaces, the Sultan moves out of the enclosed and somewhat claustrophobic Topkapi Palace, and he moves across town to the European part of town, Galata and Pera, and he builds new palaces according to 19th century sort of Rococo style, much more open. So the whole court opens up. Ultimately, the Sultan goes to Europe, as Nasruddin Shah does, of course. So again, and that means new alcoholic beverages and ways of consuming them by way of receptions, standing receptions, begin to be all the rage, and they gravitate towards that, right? Again, in a gingerly way. They can't be totally open about it, right? But they benefit from it, and they tremendously enjoy it. And there's stories about, the Sultan gets served port. He's never had port, and he, savors. It's great. And then he orders a crate, right? That type of thing. Champagne is the best example. In other words, new drinks come in as well. Champagne, cognac, port, champagne is a huge hit because who doesn't love champagne? Bubbly. It's translucent. It looks like effervescent. It's life itself, right? So people love champagne. They love the. I think it's again Mahmoud or his successor. He loves the corks popping up against the ceiling, right? So it almost becomes like a childish fun. And then of course he dies from delirium tremens, right? So again, we have this intrusion of Western ways. And this idea that it's imposed, I think, has to be discarded because it's push and pull. It's like you can't simply blame the drug pusher. You also have to look at the user. There's a certain agency involved. We're not simply victims. And this certainly pertains in this case. They loved it. They took to it with a vengeance, right? And the Europeans were a little bit careful. But then there are other elements as well. And that is mostly in this particular, in the case of the Ottomans, the British acquire certain rights in the mid-19th century. It's called the capitulations, which means that their own nationals and their so-called protégés, mostly Ionian Greeks and Maltese, who have sort of British nationality, are allowed to operate in the Ottoman Empire with few restrictions and at lower tax rates, and the Ottoman government is not able to control that anymore. And that leads to a proliferation of taverns and drinking establishments run by these foreigners. Well, they're residents, but they're ultimately from foreign extraction, and they operate under British law. And so then the taverns spill out into the Muslim parts of the city. They had always been there, really on the periphery and kind of this, these speakeasies, underground, so to speak. But now they become more visible and more prominent, and that creates a reaction on the part of traditional people and leads to sort of heightened tensions between the Muslim majority and these Christian minorities, Armenians and Greeks in particular.
Let's come to today.
Okay.
I saw that illustration that you had in Iran where they're selling grapes on the side of the road, Angura Makhsus. Talk about the prevalence of alcohol in societies, in Islamic societies, which ban them and which don't ban them. Give us a layout of what it looks like today.
It's a variegated landscape. There is no one pattern discernible, because of course a lot of people have either become secular throughout the Islamic world. It's actually an astounding number if you look at it. Even in supposedly very pious countries like Egypt, the number of people who have become a-religious or non-religious or agnostic has skyrocketed. And we're mostly talking about young people, of course. But again, beyond that, it varies from country to country. You run the gamut. In Syria, under the Assads, alcohol was never a big deal and still isn't, in part controlled by the central government. Iraq under Saddam Hussein, until he sort of found religion for propaganda purposes, alcohol was ubiquitous and free. Lebanon, mostly Christian, in the Christian parts, fantastic nightlife, nightclubs and bars, galore, right? Egypt, large Coptic population, so the wine industry, or the alcoholic industry, beer industry was mostly in the hands of the Copts. It was regulated and restricted to some extent, but never totally banned. Saudi Arabia until recently, and still today, but of course cracks are appearing in the edifice. Total ban, right? Officially no alcohol to be found, and the same holds for many other Islamic countries. And then of course Iran is an interesting case because it used to be free up to a point. I mean, morally suspect. Let's be honest about that. It's not as though all Iranians drank. Effectively, not that many Iranians drank under the Shah, right? But it was not a problem to drink. I mean, there were cafes, there were bars. I remember I lived in Iran for a year before the revolution, and the corner of the street where I lived, Khiyawan Farbardin, there was a liquor store, and it was kind of a dark and dank and kind of an unsavory place, dimly lit and so forth. And people would sneak in there almost like getting contraband. And then you buy your panch siri there, your pint of vodka. Typically vodka was the booze of choice. And again, it was legal, but kind of a shadowy part of society. It wasn't really, but there were advertisements. You know, the Shah boosted new types of indigenous wine, you know, Rizaya and things like of that nature. And of course the Islamic Republic came and banned alcohol, but of course it doesn't mean that it disappeared. We all know that. So again, we have this, you know, landscape full of contradiction and paradox emerge. You know, for a while, alcohol taboo, you know, medicinal alcohol was allowed and became big business, just like prohibition in this country. The same kind of patterns. Don't ask, don't tell, a lot of smuggling, a lot of looking the other way. So it's a complicated landscape, of course. Yeah, and you have Angoura Makhsus, you know, the October comes and you can't find grapes on the regular market anymore because they're all siphoned off for, you know, making wine in your own bathtub, so to speak. And the Iranians are very good at that.
And it's kind of like, as you mentioned, historically, it's handled by the minorities. I know the Armenian population in Iran is allowed to drink, and like, you know, you go to the Ararat Club, the Armenian club, they have their weddings, they can drink. Is that where it's primarily, it kind of trickles down into? It's
an important conveyor belt, but that's going back to the past, because that was always the case. You know, minorities were allowed within their own communities, but then of course it spills over because you have an Armenian friend and he sells it to you, and so, you know, the cat is out of the bag, and that's how again, many, not all Iranians of course, but you have an Armenian friend and that facilitates your buying booze for a reasonable price, because otherwise you have to get it on the black market and it's expensive. It has to be carried over the mountains in Iraq, in Kurdistan. So in a way, it's basically a return to the past in some ways. Prohibited, and yet widely available if you know where to go. And it's not, you don't have to go very far. You have your neighborhood guy, the Peik, you know, who delivers it on his motorcycle.
Do you see attitudes changing throughout time? Do you see things moderating? Or things really haven't changed that much? It's sporadic. It depends on which regime, which politics they're practicing. Or do you think it's been kind of a moderation as far as look the other way in a lot of Islamic societies?
You're not talking about Iran per se, right?
I'm looking at the greater Islamic culture, and also in Iran as well.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, again, there are patterns, and you have to differentiate from country to country because they're all different. But there are certain patterns that one can discern, and one of them is, of course, global youth culture, which has overwhelmed the globe. You know, have fun. We're young and we want to drink, right? With festivals and events and so forth. And it brings in a lot of money, right? Tourism and all that. So you see elements of that and manifestations of that in places like Morocco. And to the extent that beer companies can sponsor these things are allowed, they do. But then, of course, you have pushback from the fundamentalists. So it's a battle. It's a never-ending tension between the two. And then you have drinking, of course, and it's part and parcel of the same thing in these enclaves, meaning vacation resorts, right? In say, Tunisia, the coast is filled with these resorts where Europeans go the way Americans go to the Caribbean. And there's no resort without drinking because the two go together. So they typically have these almost extraterritorial enclaves where alcohol can be served, but not in the rest of the country. Now, Tunisia is not that strict, but still, these are places. A better example, I suppose, would be, I'm not sure what the best example is, where the country itself is totally dry, but they allow it in these, you know, confined enclaves. But Saudi Arabia may go that direction. You know, because they're already talking about it a little bit, because they realize if they want to turn Saudi Arabia into an events country, they will have to make some kind of concessions to alcohol use. So they may also have these little islands. You know, it's like quiche in Iran. It's the same thing in a way, right?
Yeah.
So you can find it in that way. You limit it to tourism. So and then, you know, you have the Emirates where, you know, they're super modern and they attract a lot of people, investment, being people buying apartments, high level, expensive. So you have to allow alcohol, and of course then, you know, you make it impossible for common people to drink it because you pay American prices for a glass of wine. You charge $20 in these international hotels.
Rudi, I know I've read a lot of your books about Iran, about our culture, about our history, about our monetary system, about our food. You've written a lot about it, and I appreciate that. What will, and I understand every book I've kind of read from you, there's a takeaway. There's something like we take from there that helps us understand. What was your intended takeaway from this book? What are you hoping that your reader kind of understands going away from this book?
It's a good question. Well, if there's one conclusion, one message that I would like people to take from this book is that there is this immensely rich tradition of which alcohol is a symptom or a symbol, certainly. It's not just about alcohol, of course. An immensely rich culture in which alcohol, in all of its sort of kaleidoscopic manifestations, played an important role, and that bespeak beauty and openness to the world and tolerance, as reflected again in poetry, in the visual arts, but also on the ground, in society, a kind of a live and let live atmosphere, which I certainly don't want to glorify because, a lot of people did fall foul of the law, and if they were on the wrong side of an edict, people were horribly punished. Their ears and nose cut off, and, people even died. And certainly the lashes, 80 lashes is the formal punishment. So I don't want to minimize that or embellish any of that. But by and large, a far greater sense of live and let live than modern Islam projects these days. Because Islam in the modern world, both here and there, so to speak, in the West and the Islamic world, projects itself as this grim, uncompromising, scriptural religions, rules, and mostly negative prescription. You can't do this, you can't do that, this is forbidden, everything is forbidden. So I try to open up a universe that existed until quite recently, and that was curtailed and marginalized and censored, and literally censored in many ways, because a lot of this literature, for example, is no longer put out integrally. It's censored. When Iran is a bit of an exception because the authorities can't really touch Hafiz and Khayyam. They're too sacrosanct. But a lot of the authors, Abu Nuwas, people don't learn about Abu Nuwas in the Arab world. He wrote mostly in Arabic. You think it's part of the curriculum? No, he doesn't exist. So whole parts of that culture have been chopped off, eliminated, excised, I think to the great detriment of the full humanity of people in the Middle East, knowing about their own culture and its richness. It's incredibly impoverishing, I find. And that's what I would like to people to take away from this book, a sense of the richness and the tolerant and open-minded element in traditional Islamic society and culture.
And the forbidden fruit.
Yes, sure. And again, I think alcohol plays a beautiful role because it touches on all kinds of aspects of life and society.
While I have you here, I want to touch upon a couple of other subjects, if that's okay. First of all, you're here in LA to honor Professor Yarshater and his memory and the Persian Heritage Foundation as the president this year. Tell us a little bit about that organization, what it is, what it stands for at UCLA.
Right. Well, the Persian Heritage Foundation is not located at UCLA. We are a freestanding foundation, which was created by Professor Yarshater a long time, decades ago. It's basically a grant-giving foundation, so we sponsor scholarship, we sponsor lectureships at universities, individual grants, research grants for academics, for scholars, both graduate students and established scholars. Finish a book, subvention for a book that's otherwise will be too expensive, things of that nature. I'm here to participate in the opening of the Yarshater Center of Iranian Studies and the study of Iranian literate culture. I forget the full name of it, at UCLA. We found a home at UCLA for this institution. It used to be at Columbia, but for all kinds of reasons, we had to part ways with Columbia, and so we transferred the institute to UCLA. And so it will be, hopefully, and we have full confidence that this will happen because we have the full support of the administration, very great enthusiasm by the dean and by the current director of the existing Pur Dawood Center, which is a center for the study of pre-Islamic Iran. Rahim Shaigan, who runs that outfit, will also supervise the newly installed Yar Shater Center. And it will be both a center of research and the spread and propagation of Iranian culture writ large. And I'm not just talking about Iran, the country as it exists today, but the Persian world. So every part of the world where Persian as a language and as a culture either flourished or still flourishes. And so that runs the gamut all the way from Turkey to India and from Central Asia to parts of the Arab world. But it will also hopefully play an important and a pivotal role in the community as an institute that will spread the achievements of the cultural powerhouse that Iran has always been and continues to be.
Tell us a little bit about Professor Yar Shater, the man.
Okay. Oh, Yar Shater was a giant, intellectually speaking and academically, who dedicated his entire life and treasure to the cause of Iran. He had already made a name for himself in Iran. He came to the United States in the 1960s, was professor of Persian literature, language and literature at Columbia, and has an enormous oeuvre to his name, countless books and articles about all kinds of aspects of Iranian culture, poetry, literature at large, dialectology, aspects of language, dialects, a whole treasure trove of works, and also indefatigable in promoting, setting up, creating series. The important, there are at least 10 different series that he sponsored and oversaw and edited, one of which, A History of Persian Literature, which is in the making. There are 9 major volumes now. It's meant to result in a total of 20 volumes. So the totality of Persian literature from the beginning, from pre-Islamic until today. Most important achievement is, of course, his creation of the Encyclopedia Iranica, which he shepherded and oversaw until the end of his life, and which resulted in thousands upon thousands of entries. It's really the centerpiece of Iranian culture, again, Iran writ large, an enormous storehouse of information, an absolute treasure trove, which unfortunately is suspended for all kinds of reasons that I don't want to go into, and so we were not able to bring the encyclopedia to UCLA, however much we would have liked that to happen. So that may be for the future. But to come back to Professor Yar Shater, an absolute luminary who lived a life of frugality, amassing large amounts of money, not in order to enrich himself or for self-aggrandizement, but all for the cause. Iran, bringing out Iran, publicizing Iran, its beauty, its culture, its achievements, and that will be his enduring legacy. And part of the legacy is precisely the institute that we just officially opened symbolically, because it will take time for it to gain momentum and get up and running, but at least it was opened for the community, so to speak, day before yesterday.
Yeah. It's befitting that his name is remembered in such a way.
Very much so.
We've kind of reached the end of this program, but I want to ask you a question about Iran and current state. First of all, I'm sure you guys want to know more about Professor Matthee and his work. We have about 2 interviews, about 6 hours of talks with Professor Matthee about Safavid Iran, about Qajar Iran, about the history. We invite you to go watch it in our podcasts. I want to ask you one thing, because I know you've written extensively about Russia and Iran, the history of Russia and Iran, and bring it to today. And we see Iran's involvement in Ukraine, and we've traveled around Europe. We see the discomfort this has caused for a lot of people. We see the dangers that this has created internationally. Let's get back to the people of Iran. We hear their history of colonialism of the British in Iran. We know that history pretty well. Everybody knows the history of America and our involvement there, from the CIA coup to supporting the Shah. But how is it that the history of Russia and Iran has gone missed? How is it that nobody is talking about it? I know that it's in history books and academia and people cover it, but it's not in our current psyche.
Right.
Both in Iran and outside. We see Foreign Minister Lavrov talking about American involvement in Vietnam and Afghanistan, and they're very vivid about our history and what's happened here. I don't see a counter narrative. I don't see it from the American politicians. I don't see it from the media. I don't see it from the Iranians as to the danger Russia poses for Iran. I mean, we've cozied up so much to that country without knowing the history, from Catherine to the Turkmenchai to Golestan to Gilan to Azerbaijan to Mahabad to World War II. Have we forgotten all this?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. We could talk at least for another hour about that, but we don't have time to do that. So let me sum it up. My take on this. Yes, it's true, of course, that the British have always had this magical role in the Iranian mind. The outsiders who manipulate everything and who are always behind the scenes, sort of, playing Iranians like puppets on a string, right? It's always the British. Certainly the older generation. It's waning a little bit among the younger population. But for older people, there's a Brit behind every tree. There's an accent, it must be the British. And it's remarkable because, the Russians don't have that same imaginary role in Iranian minds at all. Whereas in reality, and I've argued this in several of my articles, and I edited this book, Russians in Iran, in part induced by this enigma and trying to, solve it somehow, or at least shed some light on it. In effect, if you look at it historically, the Russians really, they took northern Iran and controlled it and brutally behaved there. A lot of people were killed. And if it hadn't been in part for the British and the Americans, northern Iran might have become Soviet, following World War II. Stalin's refusal to retreat initially, right? American pressure by Truman that forced him to do so eventually. But they were busy building Soviet republics in Mahabad and Azerbaijan. But again, the Iranians don't have that same kind of suspicion about the Russians. And I always think there are two reasons for that. And now we're getting into psychology, so I have to be a little careful. But I truly think that we have to look in those directions. First of all, there is this notion that the British, it's the position via the British on the part of Iranians is a mix, I think, between dread and fascination and even admiration. Because there's this idea that the British are very clever. They're almost as clever as we are. Zerang is kind of the quintessential Persian term here. So there is this hidden and usually inarticulated admiration almost, like, they know how to navigate things, We're just smarter than they are, but just by a hair, right? And so that also explains then this ubiquitous presence of the British, right? Because your enemy that is shadowy and devious, can pop up anywhere. It's sitting under the table here, so to speak. The Russians, you get what you know and you know what you get. The Russians are clodhoppers. They're brutes. It goes back to this earliest documentation about the Russians. They were seen as, sort of thick-skulled, dim-witted drunks, right? And I don't want to disparage the Russians, but they were literally called the Uzbeks of Europe in the 17th century, according to Chardin, one of the major travelers. And so the Iranians always had never any illusions about the Russians. All you could get from the Russians was force and power and brutality and violence. Whereas the British, and this is another element, certainly in the 19th century, elicited hope on the part of the intellectuals. British parliamentary system, we want to be like that. The whole constitutional revolution was about representation. So, and Britain was a model more than France. France was a model in all kinds of other ways. Modernization, City of Light, Paris, and so forth. But the political system, the admiration was the British system, right? The model. And then, of course, the British, not just in Iran, but especially next door, and the Iranians were looking what was going on there, they didn't practice what they preached in India. And that's, of course, quintessential colonialism. right? Democracy or representation is good for us, but you guys are too primitive. That may come later under our guidance and tutelage. So there was also this unrequited love, if you will, kind of disappointment. Yeah, the British talk a good talk about representation, but look how they behave here. Just trying to undermine us here. But again, I come back to the difference effectively on the ground in terms of the mostly negative influence of the Russians, because again, the Russians didn't have much to offer. Some hardware. Some Iranians went to Moscow or St. Petersburg rather for training, but most went to Paris and to London, right? And it's still true. Who goes to Russia to seek asylum other than some really unsavory characters? Massive immigration. They all knock on Europe's door. They all want to go to Britain still. So that is kind of my short answer to the question.
Thank you.
You're
Professor
welcome.
Matthee, thank you for being here. We appreciate everything you do, all your work, particularly on the subject of Iran. Angels Tapping at the Wine Shop's Door. Interesting book. I recommend you read it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's fun.